Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Military Mindset for Business podcast, where I've got a guy here who's probably got the best personal brand name ever, or the best one that I've heard anyway. We've got Allan the Crisis Guy. Allan, nice to have you on the show today, mate. How are you?
I'm great, and thanks for the invitation. Lovely to be here, Pete.
No, it's a pleasure. So, Allan and I have known each other for many years. Uh, Allan, why did you get the name the Crisis Guy? Where did all that come from?
It's interesting. I think that people told me it was not. I've worked in crisis management, which we'll unpack in our chat. But people kept saying to me, "Oh, you're the crisis guy." And it just sort of had a ring to it. And I thought, sounds pretty cool. And we're actually working with a lawyer on a job, and she said, "Oh, as lawyers do, you've got to register this. You've got to trademark it." So we went through the process and trademarked it, and here we are today. But that's how
Well,
it
it's
all
not
came
like,
about.
yeah, it's not like there's anything wrong with Allan Briggs. It's a nice, regular kind of name, but the Crisis Guy's got a bit more of a ring to it. So, mate, let's unpack this story, because it's always about looking to tell people stories. So, this great business that you've got, the Crisis Shield, started many, many years ago when you were a young copper. Can you lead us down the path of what ended up, in a moment of madness, I guess, did you decide to join the police force?
Good question, Pete. Well, I think actually it all started back. I originally left university, qualified as a surveyor. So I was out in the field surveying, and interesting job outside. A lot of mathematics, which I quite enjoyed. So I really enjoyed that element. But I was a young guy in my early 20s, and I don't know. It's just how things fall out. I kept seeing police sort of drive past, so I'm down the street and thought, these guys look pretty sharp and it looks pretty exciting. I was just looking for, something a bit edgy, and I thought, I'll apply for the police force. So put my application in, and went through okay. And next thing I was a constable on the street. So that's sort of how it all generated.
This is the Victorian Police. Whereabouts did you grow up?
Grew up in regional Victoria, but I was at that time with living in the city. So based in Metro Melbourne, still actually doing a lot of work in regional Victoria with the surveying. But just sort of had that, I suppose, that youth. You're looking for something exciting and edgy, and while surveying was interesting, it just didn't quite have that excitement that I was looking for at the time.
Well, it's one of those things, even though this podcast is called Military Mindset for Business, military mindset isn't just about military people. It's a way of thinking. And there's so many parallels between, the military and other career paths, particular first responders and particularly police. So I'd love to know, what is it like? What's life like as a junior copper doing beat work?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I joined in the late 90s. So, sorry, the late 80s. Getting losing time. Late 80s, and look, it was a very different police force back then. Social media didn't exist. I think and I'll unpack this a bit later, but I think the public were far more on side with police, and was seen to be. I think community policing was pretty strong, and I certainly felt that when I was in the police force. It was always like we were working with the community. And as a young police officer, look, it's exciting. You work particularly a Friday, Saturday night on those balmy nights, and you're just racing from one job to another. And it's exciting. You're going to brawls and domestics and car accidents, and it's quite an adrenaline rush. But after a few years, I thought, firstly, you go into a lot of negative things, which you can't really, if someone's been robbed or they've been in a car accident, you can't turn back time. And it's just pretty harrowing on you personally and on your home life, because you're working a lot of odd shifts. Your adrenaline's running, which is great, but you can only run on adrenaline for so long.
What's the training like? I know, to be a young infantry soldier, or to become a soldier, you go away and do your 10 or 12-week course as a basic soldier, you learn your basic rifleman skills, and then you go do your on-the-job training for whatever particular corps. It might take 6 months or a year to get skilled up. What's the training like to become, a generalist copper and to get you on the ground?
Well, back in my day, it was 20 weeks, which is a fair, whack of time to go through the police academy. And it's pretty full on, like just from memory, you're starting around about 7 in the morning with parade. So they're checking you there and looking at your, athletic wear or your uniform, depending what they scripted that you had to wear. And the whole day was basically doing law, doing physical drills, combat down the range when you matured a bit more, progress through the course. So it was a fairly intense 20-week training. It absorbed a lot of your time. But and looking back, I mean, when I went through, it was 30 plus years ago, it was it was pretty brutal in a lot of ways. And, like they wouldn't get away with it. It just doesn't run like that anymore. There's, it's adjusted to the climate, if you like. But, the funny thing was I look back and it did instill a lot of discipline. And I think I had that inherently in me, but that just really, just really reinforced it.
If anything, I think the parallels must be, there's more familiarity or complementary, actions between, military training and police training, dress and bearing, how you act and present yourself, running between different uniform changes for whatever class you're on. Do you do much? You do drill and marching around?
Correct. Yeah. I don't know if they even do that so much now, but we had to do drill. And it is, when you look back, it's a bit funny because it's the only time you ever use it. And, probably 3/4 of the squad are pretty ordinary at drill, but you manage through. But the whole part of the purpose is that teamwork. You've got to work together as a team, polishing your shoes, ironing your uniform. They get you on the parade ground and they'd say, all right, everyone get into your PT gear. You got 5 minutes. And if someone, and if someone was late, then all right, go back and put your uniform on and do it again.
Yeah.
And, the amount of times we did that, uniform changed until the whole team got it in time.
Yeah. I remember drill, in what I understood it, was understanding responses to command, is that you do these menial things over and over and over again. And so when the time actually matters and one of your superiors says, do this, you have an automatic response to actually do what you're told. Apart from, the discipline and the bearing and how to hold yourself, it's that automatic response to command and being part of a team and working together. That was the real emphasis behind drill. Now, I got one terrible drill. I was terrible at drill. I still today don't know whether I step off at your left foot or your right foot, or you go this way or that way. And I remember doing a catapult party for Anzac Day once, and I had the rifle just in the totally wrong spot, totally wrong angle. Had to hold it there for 20 minutes because if I moved it, terrible. It was one of the things I was just really, really, really not good at, but it's all part of the fun.
Yeah. Look, it just, at the time you think this is just ridiculous and, why are we doing this? But on reflection, it just did drill that discipline, the teamwork, and making sure you got it right.
Yeah. And some of the little humor about being on parade where, you're standing there, you're shifting, you're not going to move for the next 15 minutes in this one spot, and you're trying to whisper to your mates or blow a fly off your nose or something like that. It's good fun. But mate, tell me about, you moved from being beat copper, I don't know if that's the right term, a community copper into media. What was, if I can ask, being on the beat, what were some of your best times and worst times as a copper?
Look, great best times of catching a crook, I have to say.
Yep.
If you catch a crook committing a crime, and I'm not talking about someone that's 5 kilometers over the limit. I'm talking about someone who's broken into a house, stolen the car, might have been a pursuit. Someone says, look, I heard someone in my backyard breaking into the car or the house, and you catch the offender, and taking back the station, interview, total, but you get home, you're just buzzing. I've got to say it is quite an adrenaline high to do that. You feel like I've caught a criminal. I mean, then as you get older, you start unpacking and go, well, why is this person doing the crime? And I'm not here, pro crime, but sometimes you find it, they're actually on drugs or, they've got mental health issues. So it's not always, but initially when you're younger, you think, great, I'm catching crooks. How good's that? You don't think too much behind, why that person's in that position. So that was certainly the buzz. That was the highs. The lows were going, particularly domestic violence, and I know that's probably one of the toughest, I think, parts of policing. If you go to, well, from my experience, if you went to a fatal car accident, it's horrific, but unless you know the person, you are reasonably removed. You're there to do a job. The ambulance will turn up, fire brigade. You all sort of working together to resolve, clean it up and investigate. But when you go to domestic violence, you're dealing with people, emotion. There's always two sides to the story. It's very hard, and the reality is you leave and you haven't resolved it. I mean, you may separate them, you may arrest the male or female, depending on what the situation is. But you go home and think, well, tomorrow or next week that's going to happen again. So it's just not it's just not very rewarding, to be honest.
And it's one of the things I've always reflected on is, like, for some reason, coppers have got this love-hate, relationship with the community. Some people love them, some people hate them, no matter what. But when you're in trouble or when your mum's in trouble, who you're actually going to call? Yeah. And regardless of the way that police are treated, they always turn up and they always just do an amazing job. So hats off to, your service as a police officer and all the existing first responders out there today. It's really a service career. And there's something special about doing that for the community with very little thanks and rewards sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. Look, some say it's a thankless task. I do feel there's an element of like military. You know what you're signing up for. I always, when I went to accidents or scenes where members of the public turned up, and I think, well, you haven't signed up for this. You haven't been trained for this. I always felt a lot of compassion for them. Whereas, in a sense, we sort of took this role on, but even so, when you do it time and time again, it does impact you, what you see and what you have to deal with.
And I have to admit, with my experience, we get to wear our medals around in Anzac Day, and because I've been to Afghanistan, people take a certain perception of what my experience was, and I say this nearly on every podcast. Individual experiences vary. Like, I wasn't a combat officer. I didn't see a lot of trauma myself, with my own eyes. There was a lot around me, but it wasn't something I was directly exposed to. And for a military person, I believe we have a lot of support and transition to help us go through, into our next phase of our career. But I'm not really sure. So, sorry, we also have something called the Department of Veteran Affairs, like a government agency that spends billions of dollars every year on supporting soldiers, which is a great thing. But what about first responders? What do you have in that space, or how does the transition managed for you, for your mob?
Yeah, I've got to be careful what I say, in the sense that it's been a few years since I left. So, and think, look, from what I talking to friends I've got are still in the police force, and what I've observed, that's come a long way. So, like if you turned a major incident or fatality, for example, a fatality, the sort of mandatory counselling that you've got to go and do. Whereas, it's interesting. I'm just finishing a book actually, and on crisis management, and back in the day, the stress management was everyone goes down the pub and gets pissed, and to be quite honest, most of the people drove home. So that was the sort of the way you dealt with it. You turn up to work the next day hungover, and everything's okay in theory. So that was the old days. In fairness, I think today it's a lot better. It's recognised. There's a lot of support there, and I think the biggest things have taken the stigmatism out of it. So it's okay. So look, that really shook me up and upset me. I need some time out. I need counselling. Whereas, back in the day when I went through that, you would have looked upon, well, you're weak, and you just wouldn't say it. You just hold it inside.
Yeah. And because the ability for the coppers to keep backing up and to have an enduring career, rather than get to a point where they, for whatever reason, need to transfer. Like, we need good people in the force for as long as we can. And, like the military, everyone has their time, and it's time to transition. And on that note, what really triggered your time to transition? So first of all, from the beat police into the media unit, what was that like? And then out into the big wide world again.
Yeah, what's interesting, it's once again, just not really planned, but while I was operational, I noted that, I've always had this motto, one good police officer in the media unit is equivalent to 100 on the beat. So in the local police station district where I was working, I started writing little articles in the local paper, and just things about, locking your car. Don't call the police if there's two kids yelling at each other and say that, there's a gang of kids stabbing each other. So I started doing that, and I found it had a fairly good impact on crime rate and perception. People going, oh, this is good. So that's how it sort of kicked off. And then a position came up in the police PR unit, and I applied, and I didn't realize. I thought, it's a strong competition, see how I go with this. And, later on they said, oh, you were just, we knew the minute you applied, you were going to have that role. So then I moved into the police PR unit, and that's where I actually, I loved it because it was more proactive. And I could also see working with the community, listening to their concerns, you could have a lot of impact. It's not all about, running down the street with a gun or a siren. Sometimes just listening to people, changing things, and getting the community to work with you. I found it very rewarding, but also very effective.
Because when you transition out of the cops, we've still got a bit of a gap to fill here before you started your own business. Can you take us through these next couple of years before the Crisis Shield came to existence?
Yeah. So just quickly, just on the policing, and part of the reason that I got to Crisis Shield is that I always remember in the police community, and again, it was exciting because I used to go out to all the big jobs, the searches, plane crashes, fires, homicides. So, you turn up on site, quite often doing a media interview. And the interesting thing I noted there is that some companies, when I turned up, like they had well and truly planned and prepared. And they were very calm, even amongst the chaos. I thought, these guys are pretty organized. And some companies had no preparation whatsoever, and it was a mess. So I thought, there's something to be said for planning for a bad day.
Yeah.
So that sort of planted a seed, if you like. And then I was quite settled, sergeant in the police force. Thought, oh, this is pretty good. This will do me for my career. And I got a tap on the shoulder, and government said, look, there's a role at the State Emergency Service to manage all their media, comms, PR, and we think you should apply.
Hint.
So he did. So I applied, and what a coincidence! I was successful in getting the role, and that was interesting because I left the police, and I thought going to SES, that's how hard could it get? After leaving police, and in the 4 years I was there, we had some of the biggest floods, Black Saturday. We had a volunteer drown during training. We had plane crashes, all sorts of pretty major events for the state and for that organisation. So I learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, but also learned a lot. So it was a terrific further, upskilling, if you like, after police.
Can you give me a few insights? Again, two very service-driven organizations, one paid, one volunteer. What was some of the key differences between that you saw from SES and police, State Emergency Service?
Yeah, well, I wasn't a volunteer. I was on paid staff. It's interesting. I think the policing obviously had a long tradition, had a really strong model, and had a lot of funding. So, and quite the discipline. So SES was sort of like, if you like, the poor cousin, if you like. So it was interesting. I watched the volunteers it was interesting. A lot of people came there because they had the same passion to help. A lot of them looked, I think, for a bit of escape. They had say, for example, an office job, didn't want to go to military or police, but wanted a bit of that adventure, which I suppose I was looking for in my early days of policing. And so they were great people to work with. They're very passionate. And it's interesting, even towards the end when I left, the amount of training and discipline that's needed, even in the volunteer organisation, that's just not SES, but the Red Cross and Fire Brigade, it's pretty high these days. They're pretty high standards. So it was interesting to watch the how they manage things. SES is still grappling with a bit of a label, if you like, of the old dad's army sort of. But look, they certainly come a long way with the training and just the respect. I think they've lifted themselves up to a very solid emergency service.
I'm always interested in where this seed of entrepreneurship or, where this actual desire to create a business goes from. So when you've been a copper now, you've been in PR, there's some really great blending of core practical skills that you're going to take into this new business. Did you, at this stage, do you know you want to do this, or where is this moment where it's like, hey, there's something in here, I need to give this a crack?
Look, I think it was more, I just wanted to time out. I thought, I just felt like in a sense, might sound a bit.
Hang on. So starting your own business is taking a time out. The easy part,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it?
Yeah, well, it's in it because I thought, look, I feel like, I was starting to, the award ceremony, the annual driver reviver. And I was like, look, I feel like I've, sort of ticked all the boxes. I've been here 4 years. I just think it's time, I don't, I just don't feel I'm getting challenged here. And I thought, look, I'll just have, I had a bit of leave saved up, some money saved up. I thought, look, I'll take a bit of time out and then I'll think about what I want to do. So at that point in time, on the cards was actually going into a corporate job because I had a fairly good, strong skill set, or maybe starting out my own. And then I thought, look, I think I'll just give it a crack on my own. And it was one of the fascinating things I found was because police and ECS, a lot of people I knew came up to me and shook my hand and they said, "You're doing what I wish I could do, but I just can't do it." So I admire you for having a crack.
Do you mean just having the courage to step out of the steady job, good pay, nice and secure, and just literally those words, give it a crack. I'm just going to give this thing a go.
Yep, give it a crack. Yeah. And when I look back, like the amount you learn when you open a business, like I worked fairly hard during the emergency services, and I think that was just a warm up for running a business. Like even today, it's so brutal. Like, just trying to find clients, keep clients, keep the pipeline running a business. I didn't have any business skills, knew the product inside out and was very passionate about that. But, that and running a business is.
It's interesting you say that, because I know coming from the military experience, there's a few things that we are like really good at. Operations, organization, leadership, teams, policy, procedures, all of the detail. And you mentioned there, you can be really good at doing the job, but business itself has its own, it's like resetting and restarting again. And what I found in my experience was, number one, how to sell and the worthiness to charge and price what I'm actually worth, and to say, it is actually to ask people for money to pay for it, and so that, again, I always use this term worthiness. I didn't feel like I had the value, just in myself to charge people for it. Then after that, so then marketing is a whole other thing, in terms of how I actually share the message of what I do. But probably a couple of the most definitive ones were cash flow and accounting. It's okay when you spend an army's money. It's another thing when you've got to cough it up yourself. And the other one is just the dark arts of digital marketing and how the digital ecosystem works. So it sounds like a similar kind of story. Does that resonate with you in terms of your challenges, from the skills to the business acumen?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I'm pretty confident saying generally most small business owners, when they open, know their business very well. And that's probably the reason they're going, look, I know how to paint or, fix an engine or install an air conditioning unit or, write a crisis plan. So they're actually very highly skilled in that, but they're not usually very skilled in running a business. And I fortunately did get a business coach early on. And one of the first meetings we had, he said, "So tell me about your finances." And I said, "Oh, it's about this, and the income's about that, and expense." He says, "There's no about." He said, "You need to know right down to every dollar. How many dollars did you spend on marketing? How much did you spend on fuel, office lease, stationery? How much is your income? What's your projected?" And that's when I started to say, "Oh yeah, look." And I'd worked budgets before, but like you said, it wasn't my money. And all I had to do was really just produce a forecast. And if it fell short, well, they just topped it up.
It's interesting you say that, because if I look at a customer, I always look at this as terms of customer journey, right? And I remember talking to you about pipelines many years ago, but right at one end of the customer journey, you've got people that don't know you exist. They're unaware of you. Then we move across, and or marketing is about how we create awareness and lead generation and get to the point where they're interested in you. And then once they're interested in you, we have to move them through a process of discovery and a solution till they make a decision about you. And that's called sales. Then after that, we deliver operations. So what happens is people generally come to the business masterful at operations, and they need to develop backwards in that journey. So you're good at what you do, but then you think, hey, I actually need some sales now. Then you need to go back and work your way backwards in that journey about how to be good at sales. Then after you've managed to, you create a few sales, you might have to put a team member or two on to deliver more work, because all of a sudden you're a victim of your own success. Then you're like, hey, I've got to get more marketing and awareness going. So it's this sort of journey from being a master at what you're doing, then understanding sales, and then understanding marketing, and then ultimately coming back to your brand and who you are and why you are is, generally how it works. And one of the biggest things that, if I had my time in business again, it would be to focus on understanding brand and marketing, before I really got into sales, to really capture why I'm doing things in business. So let's get into Crisis Shield now. Tell us how did this business start, and tell us what you do.
Well, how it started, and my wife loves this story, and because I tell her, I've still got it. I've had this crumpler, and I bought a Mac 17-inch, which weighs about 50 kilos. Probably not 50, but it's bloody heavy. And I remember literally running up and down all the streets, the city streets of Melbourne, like a vacuum cleaner salesman, knocking on business doors, literally going to businesses who I knew or thought they needed a crisis plan, saying, look, here I am, this is what I do, crisis management, media training. And literally that's how it all started. So, and even bumping into people in the street, or I'd know sometimes if I went into the foyer of this building who would possibly walk past, they're going for coffee, say, oh, how you going? What a coincidence, we run into each other. So that's how it actually started. So some of my early work was just purely, that very old school cold calling. And when I started, it was 13 years ago. So, social media, that wasn't where, and even LinkedIn wasn't where it is today. So that's how it actually kicked off and it's the old story. You pick one client, you leverage that one off the next. And I'll probably share one of our biggest moments. The client knew it. We early on, about 2 years in, we won Melbourne Airport as a client. And I distinctly remember they really drove us down on price, but they said, we know how much it's valuable it is for you to have our brand on your books. And they were right, because from then, the next client sort of said, well, we work for Melbourne Airport. They're like, oh, wow. And then you pick up, we picked up a major university, and then, then it leads, and then people go, oh, well, if you're doing them, you must know what you're doing. And we've got confidence, and you're just, leveraging from the last big name, basically.
Can we talk about the world? You're talking 13 years ago, we kicked this thing off, 2010. Yep. What's the world like in 2010 in terms of crises?
Well, it's a good question, because it's just a huge shift. When I started the business, it was interesting. A lot of companies said, look, we sort of get what you do, because we do crisis management. We work with the executive team. So when something goes wrong and that team comes together because, there's been a death or corruption or a fire or allegations of sex assault, whatever it is, and that team are pulled together, we've got a whole methodology, how we train them, how you respond. Back then, a lot of companies would say to me, executives say, look, I sort of get what, it sort of makes sense, but you know what, if we start doing that, sort of implies that we think that's going to happen here. And, in fact, I had a few early clients said, don't ever tell anyone that you're working for us, because we don't want people think we're worried about having a crisis. Move 13 years later, it's just fascinating, because now people are knocking on my door saying, look, we're really worried about a cyber attack or a pandemic or staff issues, or production failure. Can you come in? And we're actually going to tell everyone we're doing it, by the way, because we see the value in it, and it's seen as a good thing to do, which is good for the business, but it's a huge shift.
Because when I sort of reflect at 2010, I'm thinking, Afghanistan war is in full swing. There is potential terrorist activities, Lint Cafe, attacks in Sydney. But it's not necessarily everything that dramatic. It's, the daily operations in a business where random things can happen, and, the Swiss cheese effect of, if all these unlikely events occur at the one critical moment, and all of a sudden, bang, something's happened. And how does the company now react? So it's not just about PR, is it? And managing the media and the conversation around this. It's actually about preparation.
Yeah. And look, I think in fairness to businesses, a lot of them just never had the exposure. I mean, they had things go wrong. Social media wasn't as strong as it is today. The focus wasn't so strong. So today, people have been impacted. People have had cyber events. They've had union issues. They've had terrorism threats. They've had fires, active shooters. They've had suicides. They've had, directors, releasing confidential information. So now people go, this shit actually happens. We've experienced it. We've had maybe a near miss, or we've actually been hit. So it's now accepted this is just part of business. And that's, probably a bit sad, but the reality is that's the world we're living in today.
One of the things we've always talked about is the similarities between what you do and what the military does. Is I find a lot of business owners plan for, green fields and blue skies where everything's going to be rosy and we tiptoe through the tulips and, everything's going to be nice. But
you buy a sports car and a holiday house.
Yeah. But this is really it's about taking a contingency approach. Can you talk us through how your particular planning methodology looks at what could go wrong, so that if and when it does, you can respond and even potentially take advantages of those situations?
Yeah. So the way, I'll just quickly unpack. We have a 5-step methodology and I was just on a call half an hour ago to a prospect, and I said in a sort of our utopia, we would actually firstly do an assessment, find out where you're at, with your people, your plans, and your systems. Because if you're in good shape, then that's good. But we identify where your gaps are and where your strengths are. Next thing is you would actually write the plans, and it's interesting with plans. One thing that's been, I suppose, fortunate is over the years I've looked at a lot of plans, like hundreds, and one thing I've learned is keep them tight, keep them very fit for purpose and user friendly. Because when bad things are happening, I don't want a once upon a time manual that I've got to work through. So that's the thing. So plans, very succinct but practical and work. Then train your team so they actually know that what their role is, so they're well prepared, and then exercise them. And same as military and police, like drills, run through it, find your gaps, strengths, weaknesses, and when the day comes, you go, I've done this before, and you'll follow that sort of that process.
Rehearse.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you're looking at assessing risks in business, how do you pull apart the differences between the risks a business imposes upon itself, i.e. Melbourne Airport, a plane could crash, it hopefully won't happen, versus external risks, like the pandemic or things that are outside of that organization's control? How do you analyze or look at both the internal and the external to develop this plan?
Yeah. It's interesting because I suppose now, just being in the industry so long, I can, basically walk out to most businesses and I could probably list 8 of their 10 highest risks. I mean, there's plenty of risks out there, but and we always do ask, what's on your risk register? So, for example, right now, every company's saying, first thing on risk register is a cyber attack. So that's it. But so most companies I walk through and go, well, if you're manufacturing, what's the risk there? If you're dealing with, livestock, or you're a university, or you're a casino. So we've got a fairly good insights into the risks just from our experience, but also their risk team can give us good insights too. They go, we've identified this. Often, there's a good question. Who really is very good at making assessment of your risk is your insurance company. Is they will, and right now, and again, it's just go to multiple events and functions. The insurers are saying, if you want us to cover you for cyber, it's we mightn't even cover you, or it's going to cost you a lot of money. Try and get house insurance up in Lismore right now.
Yeah,
you'll be struggling. So insurance companies are a pretty good barometer of what they see as the risks. So, that's one of the ways we look at and go, where's your risk register from what's happened previously in your industry and your business? And what is the insurers, what are they telling you? Where do they see the risk, and where are they hammering you with your fees because they see that as a heightened risk in your industry?
If you're talking to a leadership team, you go into a business for the first time, what do you see being a company that's going to get it versus a company that's just going through the motions kind of activity? Is there anything you see there from a cultural or leadership perspective in that team where you just sort of, you feel like, these guys and girls are going to get it?
Yeah, but probably one of my best examples, we were called into a major corporation, and they were almost at ground zero. Plans were terrible, no training, no systems. So they're good for us. A lot of work to be done. And the thing I noted, they I won't say that, but they are just like our standout now. And the key reason is that their COO came to the training, and she led. She said, I'm going to this training. Look forward to everyone being at that training. The companies, I think, that struggle, where some of the leaders think, well, this is great, but it's not for me. I don't need to be there. I'm too important, or it's not important enough for my time. And that then cascades through the business. So when I come in, I see the leadership team go, yep, we'll be there for the training. They're all busy people, but we know the importance of it, and they attend, and plus they get engaged. They're the winners. They're the ones who think, you know what, these guys, and I said, these are the ones, and some of them I've seen go through real serious events, live events, and they do really well. It knocks them around, but because they take it seriously, they put the effort in, and they listen to us too, which is good. Take the advice.
Yeah. In a previous life, I was a brigade safety officer. So in the Army, we're very good at hurting people, including ourselves, whether that be, hazardous chemical incidents or falling off trucks or, whatever, the multitude of possible accidents that could happen, when you're either training or doing things, for real. And again, one of the things is a barometer of success was if the commanding officers or the leadership team, took responsibility and didn't delegate it. Even though you can delegate some of the administrative activities to support your system, that ultimate buck stops with me mentality of, for safety and risk management like this was the driver of whether this was actually going to be infused or inculcated into the culture of the organization or not. Mate, can you tell me about some examples where, this work has come to fruition in real time?
Yeah, multiple times. I've had just recent ones. We've had a client had a suicide. So it was at university. So a student took their own life. A lot of pressure on international students. Quite often the family set them, offshore, funded it, and with high expectations. And those students don't pass. And it's just, there's a lot of most unis now have identified that and put a lot of care and protection and monitoring around the students. But occasionally, one slips through. So watching that, the impact, because there's a lot of, I feel like, guilt. A lot of students have come over to to Australia to study, and didn't make the grade, and so ashamed and so upset that they take their life. So that, having those walk through them, they're pretty tough for the client and actually for us too, because it's just horrific, that it didn't need to happen, and because in a sense no one intervened early enough, that person lost their life. Cyber, we've seen quite a few of those, and don't want to try to amp it up too much, but when you get a cyber attack, it really knocks your business about. I mean, you can't operate, and you can't log into your system. There's a pretty key decisions about, and we've seen those for some of the big, well-celebrated cases of, the Optus and Medibank. When do we notify people? How much information do we tell them? It's very challenging, and it just disrupts the whole business so much. So, had another client recently. There was an international client. They were in the education sector, and there was some pretty severe cheating that was happening, which impacted their brand, potential loss of their license and their commercial arrangements. And again, just getting in there early and dealing with it, we got a good resolution at the end. So yeah, they're just very varied. I had another one with it was a poultry farmer, and this is an interesting story. The part of the farm had actually been quarantined because there was an outbreak, and they'd engaged a company to euthanize some of, I think it's something like a couple of thousand birds, and the animal liberation had gone into and put GoPros all around the farm. But what they'd actually done is gone from the contaminated sheds and walked into the clean sheds. And when a farm, just for the people that don't know, when a farm is actually quarantined like that, it's about 18 months that you can't actually operate it. So yeah, animal, I'm not, casting sides on either, but the impact of that is that it went from a couple of sheds to multiple sheds that were impacted. And the footage that they had was then, clipped and aired with the media. And the client I had, it put them in a very bad light. Although they had some good policies and procedure, some staff had done inappropriate things. So yeah, it's just interesting getting there. They're really like a deer in the headlights. The media are chasing them. They're losing contracts. It's quite stressful for them.
You mentioned something before about having, a yesterday story model or, outdated how-to guides on how to act in these situations. What would be your guidance on how regularly, this needs to be refreshed, rehearsed, and basically reinfused with the next sequence of, risks or crisis that could occur? No one thought of a pandemic. Well, I never thought of a pandemic in 2018. Back in 2010, everyone was probably thinking about a terrorist attack. But what do you see as potentially outside of cyber, things coming up next, and how often should we be refreshing this kind of thinking?
Yeah, look, actually, just unpack a little bit. Firstly, pandemic. We were running pandemic exercises back. Like the last one I remember distinctly was 2015, and it was a outburst of a disease with the client, but I always thought it would just be contained to the client. Never in my wildest dreams I think it would be a global event. But the same parallels there about masking, isolation, sanitizing, so forth. So we ran those, and a lot of clients said to us, "Look, this would never happen." It was interesting that was the perception back then. But we thought, look, well, it had happened in other countries, so we should prepare. In going back to training, I think it's interesting, depending on the nature of your industry, we do get into this default, we'll do training every year. And a lot of clients say it's a bit like the fire drill, your first aid training, well, every year. Now, if you're working, for example, in a library, fairly low risk, I'd say you might be able to get away with it every 18 months. You work in mining or a high-risk industry, military, police, they're constantly training because, the threat's real and it's more highly likely to happen. So it depends a bit on your industry. The key thing is to get your team well rehearsed. So when they come together, they know their role, they know to stay in their lane, they're calm, and no matter what it is, they work as a team. Again, a bit like military or police. I know, and that's why we have the hierarchy. And even when we're training clients, we say, once you go into a crisis response, you're in a paramilitary mode. The niceties of what you probably have in your meetings goes. We're a little bit more blunt and direct because we've got to focus and keep clear. So it's
When you're doing those rehearsals or training with businesses, how do you find some of the people in the room? Do you see some of the personality change or the inter-office, dynamics mix when you start putting some of these, more directive, more robust, get out kind of mentality?
Yeah. Look, it's interesting. Like, I mean, quite often clients by default think, the CEO should lead. And now it's interesting. Our recommendation is actually they shouldn't. And a few reasons. One is quite often they're not available. The other one is that they could be the person that's actually been kidnapped or in the plane crash, or they might be the perpetrator and cause the crisis. So we always say they should actually stand aside and potentially do media, be, advising the board and just having that sort of helicopter view. So the training goes back to getting people disciplined, again, like military police. This is your role. So in military, you don't have someone just take off and say, look, I've decided I'm going to do someone else's role. during combat, because that's putting everyone at jeopardy, and it's very dangerous. So the whole idea is similar in crisis management. We've all got our roles, our positions. You're an expert in that area. You provide guidance and response in that, but don't start moving into other lanes.
Yeah. Look, I just can't get out of my head the Simpsons episode about the peanut factory and that famous line, this is the moment we feared, people. When all of the drills about the elephants are going to raid the peanut factory, and all of a sudden the elephants escape from the zoo down the road and they're all going directly to the peanut factory. But anyway, they don't stop the elephants getting the peanuts, but this is the moment we feared, people. It's keeps going around in my head.
Yeah.
I know that, talking about discipline, here you are at, I think, probably 1:45 in the morning, London time. You operate around the globe. You're currently in London. You got, jobs in New York, all around the world. Tell us about what is the right kind of business that should be getting in touch with Crisis Shield? Like, you work with some of the serious blue chip players, around the world, universities, very posh car companies. I don't know if I can name or want to name drop
casinos.
Casinos, but for a smaller
Travel
business
agencies.
person, what's the kind of threshold of someone that should be reaching out to somebody like you for guidance?
Yeah, look, it's interesting actually, and that's probably the next iteration of excitement we've got at the moment, because realistically, unless you look as a guide, turning over probably about 20 million plus. Most companies wouldn't invest in our services, and I understand that. It's just that it's a lot of money to invest. What we've actually developed is an online tool, which we're now trying to, the next thing is actually get some seed funding for that. It's called Crisis Central. And my mantra is every business should have a crisis plan, and that might cost them $200 or $300 a year. And they've got, a very sort of templated, but very basic plan. So if they've got a fire, flood, a death, corruption, sex assault, there's a guide there for them to work through, so they don't panic, and some templated media releases. So, basically take this and fill out the time and date, and you can present that. So that's that's how, look, every business should, part of the process, it's interesting stepping back. When we go into a business, I start asking the questions, all right, well, all right, what are you doing here? Manufacturing, all right. You got a fire sprinkler system, that's great. You got cut-off machines and that. Then I start looking at, well, have you done HR training and that? So you do actually, through the role, you ask some of those questions. I think, well, you've got an exposure here because you've got all these staff. So how do you manage that? So it's about looking at your risk and what you've done to mitigate. So to me, that's one of the biggest steps straight up, because that often will reduce the incident happening. And then the next phase, of course, well, if it does happen, we're ready. We'll just kick into gear and we'll respond very quickly and appropriately.
Well, it's great to see the story, from country Victoria to being, a beat copper, through the pathway, media, PR, lecturer at university. It's like all of these things just were waiting and, sort of building or stacking up until the time was right, to metamorphose, zip into the phone box and come out as the crisis guy on the other side. How long are you overseas for? When are you back in Australia?
I've already been away for 6 weeks. I'm here for another 6. And again, just that's the excitement of the business. I knew when I left Melbourne, I thought, my prediction was, I thought there'll be a huge demand for me back in Melbourne. And the other thing is, I'm coming over here. It's a fairly big investment for time and financially. And it's like, sort of going out, and they say the magic happens in the, when you push yourself outside the comfort zone. So yes, that was the whole premise. So I came over here thinking, let's just give it a crack, see what happens. Do your networking, do your sales, and just give it a crack. And going home, if we don't make any money, I'd still feel it's a success, because you've had a crack at it. And that's sort of, I think that running a business, that's part of the attraction. It's not just making money. It's actually just trying how far you can push yourself and go to the limit. So that's the plan at this stage. And interesting, in Melbourne's or back in Australia, businesses actually, we've had so many inquiries. My team are being pretty pushed at the moment, but I've been assisting them from here. But it's great. Best thing I could have done.
Mate, well, I've loved watching your journey over these years, and how you've set up this, what is, Australia's leading and one of the world's best, crisis management companies. you're very, very highly regarded. Some of the best companies in the world, lean forward and seek your advice. And I encourage everyone to follow Allan Briggs on LinkedIn, jump onto his website, crisisshield.com.au, and just follow, listen, and learn. But mate, let's catch up when you're back in Australia for a cup of coffee and have another yarn as always. And it's a pleasure for you joining us today on the Military Mindset for Business podcast.
I really appreciate the time. It was great to chat, and yeah, definitely catch up when I'm back in Sydney.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Allan Briggs, the crisis guy, crisisshield.com.au. Thank you, everybody. This is Pete Liston.